Before I get started, it's protocol for us as Indigenous people to acknowledge the land on which we're gathered here today. And we had a beautiful opening from my sister this morning. Thank you for opening us in a good way and sharing the songs of our ancestors and opening our hearts. I too would like to recognize the unceded traditional territory of the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Matsqui people on which we gather today. I think it's really important for us to do land acknowledgements as part of reconciliation and action. I think that as a Western society, we've bought into this concept that we're separate from nature. And actually, from an Indigenous worldview, we are extensions of nature. And so when we acknowledge the land, we're acknowledging all of the ancestors that came before us, Indigenous and non, and our relatives from the animal kingdom and plant kingdom. And so I think that it's really important that we do these land acknowledgements and really call in that more broader view that we are extensions of nature. Also, a couple of acknowledgements. I'd like to acknowledge Maria LaRose for inviting me to be here today, and Fiona Douglas-Crampton, the CEO of the Dalai Lama Center. I've known Fiona for a long time, and she's a fellow Indigenous woman and sister as well. And also want to acknowledge my friend Little Drum. Her English name is Monique Gray Smith, and she spoke at last year's conference, and she has books out front as well. She's a close friend, and that's how I am here today. I stand on you, I stand before you as one mixed heritage woman, but I assure you that I stand on the shoulders of 10,000 Indigenous women that came before me. And it's really important for me to acknowledge that. Just to pick up on something that Joel had said on the panel is really acknowledging that we are one day going to be the ancestors for the future generations. And so what is the legacy that we want to leave for those future generations? And so just want to acknowledge all of the speakers that shared their wisdom before me today, and for all of you who are working with our future generations as educators and in healthcare, and for you to create the time and space to be here is really important as you're fostering the next generation of leaders. And so I feel really encouraged to be in the room with all of you today. I also want to acknowledge His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And it's today that we're gathered here in his spirit and in his honor. And it's called, the Dalai Lama for Peace and Education. And I had the incredible privilege of meeting the Dalai Lama last year in Leh, Ladakh, India, when I was there for a yoga retreat, and we practiced yoga daily in one of his temples at the Tiski Monastery. And so I had the incredible privilege to meet the Dalai Lama briefly, and he shared some knowledge with us. We had the opportunity to have some private audience with him. And my mala was blessed by the Dalai Lama, so I'm wearing that to carry his spirit with me today. But he looked at all of us and he said, "We are all the same. We are all the same, except this." And all of his humor and wisdom and grace. And he looked at each of us in the eyes and he said, "Except this, we have different noses." Love it. I just love it. And it's so true. It's about the concept of that oneness, that unity that transcends cultures and religions and philosophies. And the Hindi philosophy, it's namaste. the divine light in me sees the divine light in you. In the Sikh, it's Sat Nam, I am truth, you are truth, we are truth. For the West Coast Salish people, it's not Samat, one mind, one heart, one nation, one prayer. For the Dalai Lama, it's we are all the same except this. So I remember that one. And getting the call to be here this year was serendipitous for me. And so I feel really grateful to be here. I come from an oral history on my Indigenous side. So Maria had said that I am West Coast Salish from the Claw-Emin Nation on my mom's side. And that's located in Powell River, just off the Sunshine Coast. And actually, my mom called me over lunch, and I just wanted to touch base with her. And my grandma is from the Homolko people, which is just up the inlet. And so Claw-Emin, Clahus, Homolko, and Comox, we're all one nation, and we speak the same dialect. And we are a matriarchal society, so I would follow my mom's history through that. My dad is English and Ukrainian, and my grandma only spoke Ukrainian until she went to school when she was 7. And so I always tell people, you know, the struggle is real. I can't decide if I like pierogies better or bannock. So it's totally real. I don't know if I'll ever have an answer to that. I had some pierogies the other night, and so but in all seriousness, it's been my life journey about reconciliation, about individual reconciliation. As I have the blood and the DNA of the colonizer and the settler, and the colonized and the First Peoples. And so for me, it's been quite the journey understanding what that is to embody both. And so there's been an identity struggle within that. And so I was asked to share that story with you today. And I will get there. I did say I was from an oral history, and I am watching time. But I also just want to honor what's in the moment. And so when I come to these talks, and I do a few of these a year, is, you know, the pressure to get your slides in and the pressure to share your materials. And I'm always a little bit hesitant, and I understand from an organizational perspective that you're to do that. But part of my teachings as an Indigenous woman is that we're to honor what's in the moment. And so when I sent in my slides, and I will use them, is I'm always a little bit hesitant, like 3 weeks before, going like, I'd like to get into the room, and it's a really traditional teaching to get into the room and to be in this energy. And all of you bring so much. And my sister here, she called in the ancestors of this land. She called in your ancestors. It's a myth that we walk alone. We all walk with our ancestors. And so, and what's in the moment is that there's a lot going on for Indigenous peoples in this country. And I need to just really acknowledge that, because I was having a bit of a crisis yesterday when I found out, and I don't know how many of you are following the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Inquiry, but previous to yesterday, a few weeks ago, the Colton Boucher case, where the farmer was let go for murdering a young Indigenous man. And then yesterday, the Tina Fontaine case, who is a 15-year-old girl who could have been in any one of your classrooms. Her killer was let off. And so I had this moment where I thought, how am I going to stand in front of 500 people and talk about reconciliation? From a real heart-centered, authentic place. And I looked at the title of my speech, and it said, from individual reconciliation to global reconciliation. And I am having to dig deep and to really proclaim myself as a practitioner. And it's a daily commitment. It's a daily practice of being and embodying that spirit of reconciliation, so that I can come in front of you from like a real, like heart-centered, authentic place and talk to you about reconciliation. And so I had to do my work. It's like I can come and I can talk about all this, and that's wonderful, but like I also need to be really real about the reality that Indigenous women and men are facing in this country. And I think that the timing was perfect because it made me dig deep. It made me go work through, like I was shaking with anger. I was like confused. I was like, I have this like really, I have this philosophy that we are all good people. And so when things like that happen, it questions that, and it brings you back to your commitment around reconciliation. And so, I dug deep. I called my medicine person. I had a call with him prior to coming on stage to get really centered and to call in my ancestors and to really be in the energy of like what my life purpose is. And that's about building bridges and encouraging individual reconciliation. And also, my prep leading up to this is I'm recently a registered yoga teacher, and so I did a 40-day online heart-opening challenge that completed yesterday. So I had, leading up, so I could come to you with a really like open heart, like for reals, And so I was gonna do this 40-day challenge on my own. And I kind of, the yoga teacher that I'm studying with, she said, like, put it out online, and I had like over 100 people doing it with me. And so it was just do a heart-opening pose every evening. And I shared about the importance of being a heart-centered leader and how important that is to changing the world. Because what happens, the philosophy from an Indigenous perspective is that everything is interconnected. And I was sitting beside a wonderful gentleman this morning who said, we need more interdependence in this world. And that is a philosophy of Indigenous people. And so everything's interconnected. And so what happens inside of us is a microcosm to what's happening out in the planet. And so I share that with you before I start on all of my journey and keeping time in mind, keeping the linear time in mind. But I share that with you as a concept to think about as I move through some of my journey. And we're, as Indigenous people, we're a circular people. And so we're a seasonal people. And so the concept of this linear time from 9 to 5 and all, we need to start at this time and all of that is a foreign concept for a lot of us. And as a modern day Indigenous people, we do our best to work within that. But as Indigenous people, we honored nature and the 4 seasons. And, maybe we had planned to go hunting tomorrow, but we woke up and the messages from the wind and the land said it's not a good day to go. And so we really fostered those connections. And so I think that is really important to bring forward and to think about you as an individual, and also challenging the linear system in which we're all maybe not comfortable dealing within. And so just honoring yourself and honoring the wisdom that's already within you. And I think those are some key messages that have been shared today. So as I said, what we do inside of ourselves to foster taking care of ourselves, to foster that inner reconciliation shows up in the world. Gandhi had said, be the change you'd like to see in the world. And so if you unpack that, what does that actually mean? It means that you are doing the work that so that you can be the person who you'd like to see the rest of the world be. And it's amazing to see how that energy spreads throughout. So this is a picture of a residential school in Kamloops in, I think it says 1954. And I mean, no disrespect to the generations of my ancestors, to just briefly touch on the residential schools, but I thought that it was an important piece to call in, since I'm with educators. And there's lots of information about the residential schools in my dear soul sister Monique Littledrum's book, Speaking Our Truth, and Tilly and some of the children's books that will go deeper into that. And also it's part of the mandate letter of the province's Minister of Education to have Indigenous culture and history implemented in this province and in our schools. The reason I bring it up is I'm the first generation of Indigenous people, of Cla'emin people that did not have to go to residential school. And I'm going to be 35 this year. So I just want to take a moment and ask everybody who's over 25 to stand. So have a look around the room. We have one young gent, I think, sitting, and that's it. So the last residential school closed in 1996. So if you are Indigenous or you were Indigenous, you could have went to residential school. So thank you for standing. So the legacy of residential schools is too many for me to name, but what happened there, really, the mandate was to kill the Indian and the child, and through an education system. And so what the current generation is faced with, my generation is faced with, and our generations are faced with, is reverse residential school. So building up children so that they love themselves, so that they know who they are, so that they're not just, a couple pages in a history book of Indigenous people who aren't fully dressed and look savage or uncivilized. And so I think I wanted to share this a little bit with you because my mom did go to residential school for a number of years and had a horrible experience there, and was physically, sexually, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally abused for several years. And her story, unfortunately, is not unique for Indigenous people. We had over 150,000 Indigenous children over 100 years of history go through residential schools. And we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada who talked with the residential school survivors and gathered over 7,000 stories from those residential school survivors that has translated into 94 calls to action. And so that's the real kind of macro picture of what the framework of reconciliation is in this country, and a political framework. And so there's a number of education calls to action within the TRC, and it goes anywhere from child welfare to youth to the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. And so I would recommend, if you haven't yet had a read through those 94 calls to action, and if you feel really called to read the report, it's hundreds of pages, but definitely worth it. And you could Google Truth and Reconciliation and that will come up. So this is a picture of my mom and me. I still have the cheeks, no matter how much I work out. and eat gluten-free. The West Coast cheeks are still here. I show this picture to just give you a glimpse of who my mom was and is, and that she, still struggles from the symptoms of residential school. So she has chronic alcoholism and severe post-traumatic stress syndrome. And I didn't find out about her residential school experience until I was 22. And she called me one day up at work and she said, "Chastity, I have this court case in Vancouver and it's next week and I'd like you to come and support me." And I said, oh, is everything okay? And she said, yeah, I'm going to court because, those schools that they put the Indian kids in, I went. And I was like, no, never heard of them. So I went with her, and I took 10 to 2 off of work, and I said, I've just got to go support my mom. I didn't know what I was getting into. I'll be back. I went for the morning, and I came back in the evening. That's the type of woman I am. I work hard. So I went, and one of the women from the Indian Residential School Survivors Society had said, Chastity, I'm here to support you. And I said, it's all good. This is about my mom, right? And so I learned about my mom's residential school experience through her hearing. And so it was eye-opening for me. And I was working in a non-Indigenous organization in organizational development and leadership development and coaching and just really always passionate about human development and how transformational change. And so after I learned about my mom's experience, I have had this total call to work with Indigenous people. And I started to learn more, and I got more and more curious. And I started to do research, and then I found out that more of these people of Indigenous people had gone to residential schools, and so I wanted to be a part of the movement, and I wanted to create change in this country, and not just from a political level, but from an individual level. And so that's how I got into my work. This is a picture of my dad. He's, like I said, English and Ukrainian, and again, that's me with the cheeks. And my dad's father went to World War II and suffered from PTSD as well. And I don't think we often talk about that in our war, we're all probably children of the war and have ancestors that went. And so just thinking about the larger macro pieces, and I loved that, again, Joel Solomon brought that up about the colonial history, and war is part of that colonial history. And so whether you're Indigenous or non, you've been affected by that. And so I think that, just stepping back and looking at those types of things and our warriors that went into the war and came home, and it wasn't talked about, and it still isn't really that talked about what happened to them there and how that affects us today. And there's the science now. I heard lots of people talking about science here, about epigenetics. And it's something that Indigenous people have known for a long time, is that the DNA of our ancestors is pumping through our blood. So the successes of our ancestors, the hard times of our ancestors are just pumping through our blood right now. And we're carrying that history, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so to be able to move through things together as individuals and as a country, as communities, as organizations, is calling that out, calling that forward, acknowledging it, and talking about it and creating space so that that energy can move through us. Or that emotion can move through us. And I see emotion as energy in motion. And so it's not meant to get stuck in us. It's meant to move. And so the moment that we call it, acknowledge it, have awareness, dialogue about it, we can start moving through. Not moving forward from a linear perspective, but moving through. and seasonal, it's going to keep coming back, and we're going to change and evolve with that, and we're going to figure out how to move through that together. And that's reconciliation in action. This is a photo of when I lived on the reservation with my mom and my sister and two of the twins. Makes me think of the dad that was just up here, two of the twins, and twins in our Indigenous worldview is double blessing. So you are doubly blessed. And this is a later picture of me and my sister, and I just wanted to show that there was a lot of identity pieces that I went through as a child. I didn't lead with my Indigenous self. I didn't deny it, but I didn't lead with it. If I was asked, I would say, yes, I'm Indigenous. But my way about going about social justice for Indigenous people was when Indigenous children would get bullied at the school, I would step in. And hopefully my social justice has been a little bit more refined as I've gotten older. I'm not beating up kids at the playground anymore. So yeah, it's getting a little bit more refined. As I mature and understand my identity and understand more about my Indigenous heritage and my settler heritage. And so also, this is just about me coming back to that and just going back to the concept of our DNA is within us, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so my journey back to that Indigenous part of myself has been amazing. Through my work, I've worked with over 150 communities out of the 200 in BC. And I work with the cabinet ministers advising about Indigenous women issues. I work with companies like BC Hydro, BC Lotto on Indigenous awareness and really fostering reconciliation within those companies. And so I share that with you because we're in a critical time, and we are all presented with this opportunity about reconciliation in Canada. And I know that we've got US and Africa and Belgium. And so we invite you to be a part of the reconciliation movement globally. And Alice is already doing some amazing stuff, and I'd love to connect with the Belgium guy and see what's happening there. But I think it's just we're faced with this opportunity of reconciliation. And so what I wanted to talk about is that we need to seize that opportunity so that it's not the unicorn. This mystical thing that we talk about that never comes to, that we never get to see or capture. And in our Indigenous philosophy, we have supernatural beings, like the thunderbird and the wild woman of the woods and the wild man of the woods, and all of that. And we get glimpses of them. And if you're lucky enough to get glimpses of them when you're out in nature. And so why I put the unicorn of reconciliation is that I don't want to just get glimpses of it. I want us all to be a part of that movement. And as we look at the bottom of this Mount Everest of all the atrocities that have happened in this country to build Canada to make it what it is today, it's not about spiritually bypassing that and going like, you know, I'm a spiritual person and, you know, I'm going to be happy and positive about everything all the time. It's about really looking up at Mount Everest and going, what's the step that I can take today? What legacy do I want to take today or make today? So, so I kind of like this because humor is medicine. And so you better check yourself before you reconcile yourself. And so what I wanted to do, and I'm going to wrap us up with a meditation. And so I'd like to just everybody get grounded. And close your eyes. And start taking a couple of deep breaths. Maybe putting your hand over your heart if that's comfortable for you. And if you feel your heartbeat, our traditions say that's the heartbeat of Mother Earth. So feel that interconnectedness within you. Breathing into your heart, dropping out of your head into your heart. Letting the rest of the day fade away. And what you need to do next fade away. All we ever have is this moment. How liberating that is. So I want you to ask this really courageous question. Ask your heart, what do you need to reconcile within yourself? Maybe it's your identity, your ethnicity, your judgment of other people, your attachment to time, your attachment to material things, your attachment to this human condition. Just one single answer. What do you need to reconcile within yourself? Don't make yourself wrong or bad, or we would never talk to the other people the way we talk to ourselves. But love yourself within that awareness. And when you feel ready, you can come on back. And maybe write down your awareness if you're if that works for you. So just in some closing comments, thank you for doing that. And I would encourage you to be curious about that question. Because the Western way is to look external for research and answers and data and all of this to tell us what we need to do to get here and all of that. And that's wonderful. There's a place for that, for sure, in our world, and it's moving us forward. And we need to do our own inner research. Everything that we ever need, all the knowledge lies within us. And it's about creating pathways to be able to access that inner knowledge that is yours, that is your ancestors, that is the land. And so by doing your own inner research, we are decolonizing ourselves, because we're all colonized, whether we're the colonizer or we're the colonized. And we're busting the myth that whatever we need to be happy, to be healthy, to be wealthy, to be successful is external. The magic lies within us. And Rick Hansen talked about the enoughness. And when we go internal, eventually we start to feel that enoughness. So I leave you with that. And if we practice this profound daily practice of individual reconciliation, I know that we'll be able to take steps towards reconciliation in this country. Because all of the ancient and current gurus and sadhus and Dalai Lama say that the answer is love, more love. And our chiefs say that too. Chief Bobby Joe, who started the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, says reconciliation is about love. And we need to practice that in ourselves first. So thank you, all my relations.